Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our live online conversation, Bloomberg's Billions, Philanthropy, Power, and Politics. I'm your host, Aaron Dorfman, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Whether you're joining this conversation via Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or our website, I'm glad you're here. And as Steve Harvey always says, we've got a good one for you today. Now, before I introduce our panelists and frame the conversation, let me share just a little bit about NCRP, since I know we have some folks tuning in who are new to our organization. The National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy was founded in 1976 to be a voice for underserved and marginalized communities and for nonprofits. We were founded to be that voice directly to philanthropy and also to lawmakers and regulators. We are an independent, critical friend to the nation's grant-making foundations and high net worth donors. We analyze giving patterns and share our observations with the field. We also push, cajole, nudge, challenge, and encourage donors and foundations to do more to benefit and empower those with the least wealth, power, and opportunity. Our movement investment project is a great current example of that. Our original research and the content we produce is used by hundreds of foundations and donors to help them make better strategic decisions about how they deploy their grant dollars, about how they operate more effectively, and about how to leverage their limited dollars to do the most good in the world and build a society that is more fair, just, and equitable. Our Power Moves toolkit is a great example of content we create that gets used by all kinds of foundations. We have a small army of nonprofit members who join us in campaigns to influence and improve philanthropy, and who also learn to be smarter in their fundraising efforts through their engagements with NCRP. And we also have about 130 foundation members and supporters, many of whom are also part of those campaigns, and who find at NCRP a community of other funders who share their values. Today, we're going to do a deep dive on the intersection of philanthropy, power, and politics. Now, many of you may have seen the excellent piece by Alexander Burns in the New York Times that explores this topic as it relates to former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Bloomberg is one of the world's richest individuals, as we all know, with a net worth in excess of $60 billion. He has given away billions through his philanthropy, and he's also seeking the Democratic nomination for the opportunity to go up against Republican Donald Trump in the upcoming presidential election. To help us interrogate the intersection of philanthropy, power, and politics, we have an all-star panel. David Callahan is the founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy, and he's written extensively on trends in philanthropy, as well as American culture, public policy, and business. He is the author, most recently, of The Givers, Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. Before launching Inside Philanthropy in 2014, David co-founded Demos, the national think tank and activist tank. Farhad Ibrahimi is an activist, philanthropist, and founder of the Chorus Foundation, which works for a just transition to a regenerative economy in the U.S. The Chorus Foundation supports communities on the front lines of the old extractive economy to help them build new bases of power, political, economic, and cultural power for systemic change. Farhad, thanks for being with us today. And our third panelist, Latasha Brown, is a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Institute of Politics and the founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund, a power-building, Southern-based civic engagement organization that played an instrumental role in the 2017 Alabama U.S. Senate race. She's an award-winning organizer, philanthropic consultant, political strategist, and a jazz singer who has more than 20 years of experience working in the nonprofit and philanthropy sectors on a wide variety of issues. Latasha is currently speaking at a different event, I believe in Chapel Hill, and she'll be joining us just a little bit later in the program today. Let me also say here at the beginning that this conversation is not intended to benefit or harm any candidate running for public office. NCRP is a 501c3 nonprofit and is prohibited from electioneering. Nothing said here today should be misinterpreted to be an attempt to influence anyone to vote in a certain way. And with that said, let's get this conversation started. I'm going to turn first to David Callahan. David, you wrote extensively about Michael Bloomberg's philanthropy in your book, The Givers, and you have covered his giving also on Inside Philanthropy. I'm curious what you find most notable about Bloomberg's giving and what your thoughts are about how his political campaign and his philanthropy intersect.
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, Aaron, for putting this together and for having me and including me. There's a lot to cover here with Bloomberg's giving. He's given out $10 billion since 1997. He's also pumped, obviously, a huge amount of money into his political career, first as mayor, then as a major donor to the Democratic Party in the 2018 midterms, and now over $450 million in giving for his 2020 race. In terms of his philanthropy, one of the things that people should know is that the biggest priority he's had has been global health, just in terms of the raw dollars. He's put over $1 billion into a global anti-smoking campaign that he's been funding for many years. His people say that it's saved many thousands of lives. He's put big money into efforts to improve road safety and reduce traffic accidents. These have been some of his top priorities. Johns Hopkins is another major priority. And of course, climate change. And then you sort of go down from there. There's a number of different issues he's been involved in. I've often been impressed by Bloomberg's giving because he's really good at being effective in a kind of narrow way. He knows how to have impact. With his global health giving, he has not gone after any big sexy issues. I mean, people don't think much about road accidents, but they actually kill more people in developing countries than AIDS and malaria and TB combined. Ditto with smoking. I mean, that's 7 million people die every year from tobacco-related deaths. Bloomberg has been really wanted to kind of bend the mortality curve there. In his climate giving, he has really zeroed in on closing down coal-fired plants, working with the Sierra Club, and has had a big impact, giving over $150 million at this point to close, by the Sierra Club's count, some 270 coal-fired power plants with a big impact both on carbon emissions and public health. So, and lots of other things to talk about, sort of more minor issues. But the kind of broad takeaway here is that, Bloomberg is sort of a case study and a narrow kind of technocratic, impact-focused donor who, like a lot of these billionaire business people, they want to move the needle on some issue that they care about, but they're not particularly interested in disrupting the status quo, challenging any of the structures of power, or really, shifting power to people who are from marginalized communities. And we can get more into this, but that is he's a technocratic giver and an effective one. One other point about his philanthropic giving is that, like a lot of these billionaire mega givers, he's also been deeply involved at the same time in parallel 501c4 giving or campaign giving, and his giving for guns is a great example. Much of that has been 501c4 money intended to sway electoral races, and Bloomberg is the only donor who's really gone toe-to-toe ever with the NRA in terms of offering a real counterweight to their power with the Every Town for Gun Safety initiative he's backed. So just a couple points to put out on the table as we get started here about his giving.
Great. Thanks so much, David. There's a lot to unpack there. But I want to get Farhad in on the conversation. Farhad, we know one of the areas that Bloomberg has put a lot of money is climate change. And you and Michael Bloomberg are both philanthropists, albeit at different scales. But you're both concerned about doing something about climate and specifically around coal. One of Bloomberg's most visible big gifts was $50 million to the Sierra Club for their Beyond Coal campaign to help them shut down coal-fired power plants. But you've taken a different approach with your climate philanthropy, calling it a just transition. So I'd like you to explain what that is, what you're funding, and then draw some distinctions on how that's different from how Mayor Bloomberg has gone about his coal and climate philanthropy.
Yeah, and thank you for putting this together. One bit of context. So I've been running a foundation called the Chorus Foundation for about 15 years now. And we started with a laser focus on climate, not unlike, I would say, the kind of laser focus that Bloomberg's climate program has had. But we have also shifted over time into a broader multi-issue focus. And, some of that was in reaction to some of what we saw Bloomberg Philanthropies and other larger institutions pursuing. But to clarify the spirit in which I'm approaching this conversation, just wanted, not trying to put anybody who works for or has worked for Mike Bloomberg on blast. I can only guess what kind of constraints or pressures, folks might be dealing with in a big institution. And I'm sure that there are lots of good folks fighting the good fight and trying to steer things in the right direction. There have been positive changes over time. But I am trying to put Mike Bloomberg himself on blast because I do think his approaches to both philanthropy and political giving need to be examined critically, especially when he's also, a former elected official, a self-funded candidate, a media mogul, et cetera. And it's quite a bit of power and influence for one person. So one of the things that I have learned after these years of working on climate from a philanthropic perspective is, the crisis of climate change isn't really about science or technology or even public policy. It's about power. Who has the power to heed the science, to invest in the technology, or to enact the public policy? That's been what's been missing. And as a result, that has become the overarching frame, both for the work that the Chorus Foundation funds, as well as how we fund it. And these questions of power are not unique to the climate crisis. So we no longer think of ourselves as just a climate funder. We're going for what's at the center of the issue Venn diagram. And as you mentioned, we've moved from climate to just transition. And I guess the simplest way to articulate just transition is you're getting thrown under the bus. It doesn't really matter if it's solar powered. And that approaches to systems change need to center questions of equity and power as well. And it also mandates that as philanthropists, if we seek to support transformative work, then we need to pursue that kind of transformation ourselves. So going with the example of coal, I would say, Mike Bloomberg's approach to coal was to focus entirely on shutting down coal-fired power plants. He supported national and international environmental organizations to do it. Some of the concerns that we had with that was that local organizations were also essential to those fights, but rarely did they receive credit, let alone resources. There was also, he didn't seem particularly concerned with coal extraction, which is sort of like squeezing only part of a balloon and not really caring where it expands, because if you shut down coal-fired power plants in the United States, then at that point in time, remember this was many years ago, coal was being used everywhere, including China. And so the mines in the United States actually weren't slowing down. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, there wasn't a prioritization of what happens in frontline communities and communities that are experiencing not just the power plants, but the mines. And I've heard stories from our grantees about being in spaces with folks from the Beyond Coal campaign, folks from Sierra Club, folks from Bloomberg Philanthropies, and seeing a slide of decreasing coal jobs put up and met with cheers. And our grantees thinking, well, we can't just cheer that. Those are our families, those are our neighbors. If we don't have some corresponding indication of where economic development is going to come from in the absence of a coal economy, then this is not something that we can celebrate or embrace. And so we took a different approach around coal. One, we focused on local organizations. We believe that durable progressive power is built from the bottom up. We prioritize communities directly impacted by the coal industry, and we believe that effective movements, which is where we see large-scale change come from, it's always from social movements, and they're always led by those with the most at stake. But finally, we supported the full ecosystem of political, economic, and cultural interventions for a just transition. So it wasn't just about the coal. It was about folks are always going to be more effective at saying no to something if they're saying yes to something else at the same time. So we were buying into multi-issue organizations for long-term general operating commitments that, yes, they were thinking about coal, they were thinking about coal mines, they were thinking about coal-fired power plants, but those weren't the only things that they were thinking about, and they were putting it in a broader context. And so I would like to talk also briefly about natural gas, because for us, it's never been about focusing on one fuel or the other. Even when we were more of a climate rather than a multi-issue funder, it was still leaving it up to the discretion of our grantees to determine how they want to approach it. Mike Bloomberg took a different approach. He was a big booster for natural gas, including fracking, not just refusing to support grassroots groups that were fighting the fracking boom, and not just efforts to steer with strings attached larger groups away from anti-fracking work, but a personal embrace of fracking, including writing an op-ed with George P. Mitchell, who was one of its pioneers. So here, to say that we had concerns would have been an understatement. If Bloomberg were just a funder, this would have been an example of a highly directive top-down approach. Work on this issue, don't work on that issue. We have concerns about that. And I would like to evoke the metaphor of a drag anchor. Now, I got this from Tate Williams, who works with David at Inside Philanthropy, and I believe he credits Mark Dowie originally. But a drag anchor is a nautical device that steadies a ship in rough waters, but notably slows forward progress. And that it's a very useful metaphor to think about how some big philanthropic institutions and some large donors think about their roles. They're trying to bring some sort of coherency to the organizing activity, to the social movement actors. But by doing so, they're also slowing things down. They're also reining things in. They're dictating what folks work on or how they work on it. And remember, this is Mike Bloomberg we're talking about. So he wasn't just being directive as a funder. He also championed the expansion of municipal natural gas infrastructure here in New York City. He was established political mega donor as fracking has become increasingly political. He was heavily invested in the oil and gas sector. And did I mention that he was a media mogul, right? So there was multiple points of intervention around natural gas, advocacy for gas as a clean bridge fuel. That was not where our grantees were sitting on the issue. So again, we took a different approach. We trusted our grantees' assessment of what issues they needed to work on and how. Those closest to the problem are always going to know the most about what the solutions need to look like. We bought into our grantees' transformative visions. So not just the ability to win this campaign or have an intervention around a particular piece of infrastructure, but what is the world they imagine, including what does their local economic development look like? Because this isn't just about replacing one extractive industry with another. And finally, we believe that the full toolbox at our disposal should be informed by and accountable to our grantees. So our investments, our sibling action fund, my own political giving, our communication programs, the access and introductions that we can give, all of that was oriented around supporting our grantees' vision for what they want. So just to close out, I would say my concerns about Bloomberg's approach to philanthropy is that it's not only preserved his influence and power, it's expanded it. Whereas meanwhile, we've been trying to learn how to share power, even let go of it entirely. And I would argue that this isn't just an equitable approach. It isn't just the nice thing to do. It's also the strategic thing to do, because I don't think we build the broad-based progressive political power for these questions if we make the kind of selective decisions that he's been making.
Wow. That's a lot that you've put on the table there, Farhad. The sharing power bit is, I think, so important. It's certainly something NCRP has been advocating as well. And in my recent piece directed towards billionaires in response to the current sort of critical environment that of big philanthropy, there's the piece on our screen there. That's the number one thing that I think our society needs from philanthropic billionaires is to adopt some of that willingness to share power, as you've described. So thanks for making that so clear there. David, any reactions or responses to what Farhad raised?
Well, it's great to have Farhad in this conversation. Inside Philanthropy has done a couple pieces about the Chorus Foundation. And for those people watching who don't know about the Chorus Foundation, it's really, I think, a pioneer in doing philanthropy differently. And this question of sharing power has been coming up again and again our writing about what's happening in the sector. A lot more interest in that, obviously coming from a lot of different people. Bloomberg is not that kind of philanthropist. Like a lot of these big billionaire mega givers, totally out of touch really with anything happening kind of on the ground or in grassroots communities. And I do think that the kind of larger worrisome trend here is the way in which wealth is converted into power in this era in which we live, and how philanthropy is increasingly a conduit of that, a means of converting wealth into political power and civic influence. And I think that a lot of people who think about money in politics think very narrowly about it. They think of campaign donors, they think of lobbyists, they think of elections and candidates. And a kind of recurring theme of my work is that philanthropy has long been, but is even more so, a means by the wealthy to convert their assets into civic influence. And that the more, just like in politics, the more you have a small group of mega donors who are really running dominant with their flow of cash, the more other players can feel marginalized and not have much voice.
Great, thank you. I want to get some new data out on the table. Our research director, Ryan Schlegel, ran some numbers to help us compare Bloomberg's giving to the giving of other living billionaire donors who are giving enough to make it into the top 100 of the FC 1000 data set. For you data geeks out there, that's how we compiled this list. So there are a lot of notable billionaire donors who don't appear on this list. That's because either they aren't giving enough to make it into the top 100, or it's because they aren't giving enough, or because they're giving in ways that don't get tracked by Candid and the Foundation Center. So they give through an LLC, not through a foundation. There's no public disclosure of that. We can't get them in the data sets. But here on this slide, you can see two of the benchmarks that NCRP set in our criteria for philanthropy at its best. So the data on the left is giving for the intended benefit of underserved or marginalized communities. And that's a very broad definition of that. So that could be giving that's intended to benefit economically disadvantaged people, women and girls, people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ folks, a very broad definition of marginalized communities. And as you can see here, Peter Buffett and the Novo Foundation top that list with over 80% of their grants coded as being for the benefit of marginalized communities. And Bloomberg is at the bottom of this list. So we thought that was interesting and data that we wanted to share. Let me point out that you see Warren Buffett here on the list twice, and you could perhaps see him 3 times. The Novo Foundation, Peter Buffett, that is, of course, originally money that Warren Buffett earned, and each of his kids he set up with funds for a philanthropy. Where Warren Buffett is listed alone, that's the giving that he does through the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation. Where Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are listed together, that's the giving of the Gates Foundation. Because, of course, Buffett gave a huge portion of his fortune to the Gates Foundation. On the right-hand side of the column, let's look at the giving for social justice. Our benchmark, our suggestion is that a foundation ought to devote at least 25% of their grant dollars annually for systems change and social justice and advocacy, things that really leverage the limited dollars that philanthropies have at their disposal. That is sort of impactful, high leverage philanthropic giving. And Bloomberg certainly does a fair amount of that. But also on that list, he comes out near the bottom of other living billionaires who are giving through foundations so that we can track their giving. Only 12% of Bloomberg's grants were coded as being for social justice, whereas, again, the Novo Foundation and Peter Buffett tops the list with over 80% of their grant dollars going for social justice. I should also point out that it is a little bit unclear how much of Bloomberg's giving is included in this data. He does some giving as an individual, some giving through the Bloomberg Family Foundation. In the data set that we analyzed, in certain years, it's listed as the giving of the Bloomberg Family Foundation. Other years, it's listed as Bloomberg Philanthropies, which is the overarching umbrella through which all the giving is conducted. So we don't know the extent to which all of the giving is included, but this is the data that we had available to analyze. And now I want to take a look at just giving that is intended to benefit communities of color. There is, if anything has been clear in these last few years since President Trump took office, it's that racism is alive and well in this country. And philanthropy does far too little to intentionally lift up and benefit people of color. And there's sort of no exception here among the living donors. Again, Novo Foundation is more intentional and thoughtful about that than the others. But we do see Bloomberg near the bottom of the list on this as well. I think you will generally see his giving trying to benefit the entire population and no specific strategies around benefiting communities of color. So that's interesting. Here's the same chart analyzed if you just separate giving that is intended to benefit poor people. And the next slide is giving that's intended to benefit women and girls. Warren Buffett's Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation is one of the field leaders nationally on that. So they top the list here. And the last slide for people with disabilities. And Barbara Pickhour and the JPB Foundation is ahead of the pack among the other living donor billionaire foundations that we did for this analysis. So thank you, Ryan, for doing that data run for us. Farhad, let me go to you. What does that data suggest to you in relation to your own experience with Bloomberg's giving?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, what I read into it is how one thinks about issues, right? Because if we think about issues in terms of outcomes, then it's possible to try to address issues without necessarily thinking about the people and most importantly for me, the questions of power, right? Because if we think about equity and outcomes, how do we have that, right? If the processes that are supposed to lead to those outcomes are not equitable. And so when I think about approaching, global health, climate in my sector, folks can even try to approach things like policing and try to get incredibly metrics-based, highly data-driven. But that data doesn't necessarily lend itself to connecting to these broader issues of, social justice and community self-determination and things like that. And so I think it has to be an active decision, which institutions like Novo, right, and people like Peter Buffett have taken to say, we believe that emphasizing equity in process, supporting who gets to sit at a table and make decisions will produce the right outcomes, as opposed to philanthropic approaches. And I think this has been more the approach that Michael Bloomberg has taken to say, I'm interested in the outcomes. I want to fight climate change by reducing greenhouse gases. The best way to do that is to go after coal-fired power plants. That's an outcomes thing, as opposed to thinking the best way to do something about climate is to build a vibrant and representative climate movement, which would include people of color, working class white folks in Appalachia, et cetera, and figuring out how to buy into their leadership to intervene, which to my perspective, I'm confident will have the right outcomes in terms of the greenhouse gas reduction, but it's just a very different way of approaching it.
Yeah, thank you. David, before I turn to you, let me just clarify for everyone, the analysis that we just presented was on the domestic giving only of all of those donors. We excluded the global giving. It was only an analysis of the domestic giving. It's too hard to track some of those things when you're doing global giving. So,
right.
So David, what does that data suggest to you?
No big surprises to see that data. We cover a lot of these living donors who have come out of the business world. Very few of them are interested in social justice giving. Very few fund social movements. Very few are interested in fundamentally disrupting the status quo, even as many of them do focus on marginalized communities or issues of poverty. The Balmer, Stephen Connie Balmer, a great example, big new donors on the scene taking on issues of poverty and economic mobility. But they, like other living donors in that anti-poverty space, do not give any money to the new labor movements that have really been at the forefront of pushing for better wages and benefits for low-income workers. And so, a point we make again and again is, how do you deal with poverty and lack of mobility if you're not dealing with the labor market and the fact that workers have no bargaining power, and many working people live in poverty and have no basic benefits. And so that's just one example. So not surprising to see that in Bloomberg's giving, there's also very little focus on social justice. I should say, though, that is reflective of a lot of what we see from many not just living donors, but from many foundations, that there's a focus on measurable results. And the thing about building social movements and shifting power over the long run is there's no 3-year benchmark really that's easy to point to and say, hey, look at what we achieved with our grant money, when you're going to the board of trustees, right? And so this longer term investment really does take a different mindset of and Bloomberg, of all the people, of all these living donors out there, is particularly obsessed with data. When he was mayor of New York, he was super focused on kind of moving the needle in very specific areas and fixated on data to show how much progress he and his administration was making towards those goals. But one last point, though, I think one area where Bloomberg has really been a somewhat more structural thinker is in thinking about cities and thinking about urban governance. In contrast to many other philanthropists and many other politicians, including progressive ones, Bloomberg is really interested in making government work more effectively and in the mechanics of innovative government. And one of his areas of focus as a philanthropist in the last 5 years has been giving grants to cities to help mayors do innovative things. And I think that's super important and doesn't get enough attention. I think that progressives have many good ideas and big ideas for what government can do to solve problems. But if you're not deeply looking at how government works, and often doesn't work so well, you're going to have a problem actually having impact over the long term. And Bloomberg is one donor who's really been super focused on that as a priority.
Great. Thank you, David. And I'm pleased that Latasha Brown has now joined our call, I think. Here she comes. Hey, Latasha, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Hi. How are you?
I'm doing well. So just to recap where we're at, we've been talking about Bloomberg's billions and the intersection of philanthropy, power, and politics. David started us off with a bit of an overview of Bloomberg's giving, and then Farhad provided an interesting contrast in how the Chorus Foundation has sought to address issues of climate change versus how Bloomberg Philanthropies has gone about that. And then we took a look at a data analysis that showed Bloomberg's giving in comparison to some of the other living billionaire donors, and how he was doing proportionately far less of his grant making to intentionally benefit low-income communities, communities of color, women and girls, and less giving for social justice. So, Latasha, I'd love to get your perspective on Bloomberg's philanthropy and the intersection with politics there. What are the noteworthy things that you've seen, and especially as it relates to Black voters, since you're now leading the group Black Voters Matter?
I think that part of what makes this nuanced and difficult is a larger discussion. I think a part of this is around Bloomberg, but it's also around the role of philanthropy and how people have actually used philanthropy as a vehicle to gain power and favor and positioning and power. And so part of what I've seen often, particularly even in the Bloomberg space, that with his city's initiative, what we've seen a lot of mayors to come out and support him, and not saying that some of the mayors are not supporting him because they don't believe in fundamentally what he's doing or with some of the work that he's provided, but it also says something around the nature of in which we've got to always be careful around not allowing money to corrupt our politics, and how that the nature of philanthropy has been used, and we've got to be honest with that, how it has also been used as a vehicle to protect and elevate privilege. And so, one of the things that concerns me, and a major concern for me, with Bloomberg and his approach around political engagement, is the fact that he is saying that he is funding his campaign entirely himself. I think that's extremely problematic. Why is that problematic? Because I think ultimately, which is why I support campaign finance reform, that ultimately we need people that are literally funding politics so that it's an accountability to the people. That ultimately what we know is if he's funding his campaign, right, and we know that money is a critical key in elections, then who is he accountable to? And so there's an accountability question that comes up, and there's an accountability question that is eroded when you've got one person that's saying, and not the fact that he's doing it, the fact that he fundamentally is funding his campaign and does not think anything is wrong with it, and actually lifts it up and says, I don't want anybody else to give any money, right? That I'm going to give money myself. That if you're going to represent the people, and if you're going to represent the electorate, why not be accountable? Not because what we also know is that that when people are giving money to campaigns, that means that they believe in you, that they believe in you, they're feeding into your campaign. And so I think it's really important for us to look at just kind of the nature of what is happening, with how Bloomberg is approaching it. It makes me, why is the funding of his campaign, why does he not have a model set up for that to be a democratic process if he is to believe in democracy? The second thing I've seen that has been extremely troubling is I've seen particularly elected officials or people who have recently been benefactors of his giving to come out really strongly saying that they're supporting him. But then when you're pressing them on the substance, a lot of it, I can't get the substance, right? I can get the reference of things that he supported, but not the substance. And I'm not so sure if that's more reflection of him or reflection of how money and politics, and particularly when it's not an accountability, how dangerous it is, that it actually undermines the actually fundamental foundation of democracy when one is saying that if I can spend money and if I can put money, that in fact positions me. And I think the third thing for us to really look around and look at this process is part of what I think that has happened over the years, that ultimately, there's this phrase that we love to quote JFK and saying, not ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I actually have a slightly different feeling around that. I think I pay taxes and I work hard. And I think that I am the only person, and other people who are working, we should be precisely the ones that are asking what our country can do for us. We are precisely the ones that should be asking how our tax dollars are going to be used. We are precisely the ones to really talk about what we expect of our government, not corporate America, and not other interests. And so I think that we've got to really center this conversation in a way that is not really about what is philanthropy going to do? Because I'm actually really interested in if there were tactics that he's done in investment in philanthropy when he ran the city. We don't see the same kind of behavior. When he was running the city and governance, what is it that fundamentally, the question isn't about what one or two people can do just with their philanthropy, but it is fundamentally the government of this country, right? That actually is the collector of our tax dollars, that is supposed to be accountable to us. What is his view of how we use those resources, right, in a way that lifts up all votes in a way that lifts up and provides housing and economic opportunities for all. And what we know is that even during his own tenure, when he was the mayor of New York, and a city that has 7 million people, that he did a housing. One of the things that he did is there was a housing program that he did, affordable housing. And if those of you can imagine that New York is quite expensive, and without rent controls, it would be astronomical. People would not be able to live there. But even during his tenure there, the homeless issue actually got worse under his program, not better. And that even by his own admission, it was less than 150,000 new units in a city with 7 million people that were supposedly affordable housing that he provided. And so even on a small scale of what he was able to do during his tenure as mayor, how is he going to bring that at scale? And then the third and the last thing I would say is that and I'm raising this as not as a critique of saying, no one should vote for Bloomberg. I'm raising it as a critique that as we're moving forward, that we recognize that money in politics is a problem, is a substantial problem, which is why I truly believe that we need campaign finance reform. And when you have the 12th wealthiest person in the world that is saying that I am going to single-handedly fund my own campaign, it creates a whole other issue that I do think fundamentally undermines democracy.
Great. Thank you for raising those issues, Latasha. Really important to think about that as well, and the need for campaign finance reform. So I want to turn this into a discussion among the panelists, as well as take some questions from our viewers, if there are some. So Farhad, let me turn to you and see if you've got a question you want to pose to either David or Latasha.
So Latasha, I wanted to dig in further to what you referred to in terms of, folks who are endorsing him, that even the fact that we asked the question, right? Are they endorsing him because they have been beneficiaries of his generosity through his, political donations or through his philanthropy? And I think there were conversations here in New York City about, did his charitable activity grease the skids for his third term as mayor? But I'm curious to hear your take about, what does it mean? It doesn't even have to be Bloomberg, right? It can be somebody else who's a self-funded candidate who actually does get into office. What does it mean for community organizations and social movement organizations to be able to hold somebody like that accountable when they're in office? Because this is something that social movements do. You try to get the right people into office, but then you also try to put the right pressures and carrots and sticks on them in office. And how is that more complicated when the person you're talking about is, a billionaire with a philanthropic practice and a political donor practice and all these kinds of things?
I think that's an excellent question. I kind of want to go back to what I think has actually been part of the creation of Trump. I know people that said that they voted for Trump because they felt, I know a couple of Black men who said that they voted for Trump because he was a successful businessman. That part of what has happened in capitalist America is that we have collapsed the idea that if you are wealthy, and that means you are the symbol of success, that you have been successful. And because you are successful and you know how to run a business, or you've ran a successful business, then that means that you can run anything. And so I think that part of what we have to have, and it's easier for us to put the blame on a Bloomberg or Trump or other folks with wealth in this country. But part of what we've got to do is a little bit more political education with the communities that we work with around really getting out of this notion that one who has access to wealth, that in some way that they are smarter than the rest of the folks, or they're smarter than the rest of the workers. And that we keep pushing this particular narrative that has people thinking that if I can just go back to the rich guy, I can get about it. I think part of what's makes a Bloomberg attractive right now, even with everyday folks who may not have gotten any direct resources from him, is this idea that he's successful because he's wealthy. He's super wealthy. And he's super wealthy, which means he knows how to do stuff. And that means that he knows if he can run a company, he can run a country, even though they're distinctively different things. And so I think one thing that we've got to do is we've got to do more political education with our base around what that means and really understand. And I think that people don't even really understand how money works and the economy works, and really dispel and start unpacking that, or what that means. I think secondly, I think we've got to organize. I don't know anything else that works better than like they say in labor, organize, organize, organize. That we need more than ever, we need communities and organizations and labor unions, like labor community partnerships. Right now, this is when we need the labor movement, right? That we need the labor unions and community organizations or frontline communities to really be able to speak to these issues to people. Because as I'm going out on the ground and talking to folks, and even those that are saying that they're considering candidates like Bloomberg, they intentionally say, I want to do better. I want the economy to do well, and he's made lots of money, and therefore there's this belief that somehow that's going to fix things. The last thing really has a lot to do with what I think is fundamentally an outcome of racism. That part of what we have been trained and socialized in this country to believe is that our default leadership position is a white, wealthy male. That the foundation of this country was actually built on this frame that somehow white men who owned land were better prepared than everybody else to govern, to vote, to own, to control. And so on some level, because we have not fundamentally dealt with racism, we continue to use that as our default position. So anytime right now, it's really interesting, as we're talking about even the Democratic debates, that anytime that there's a question around leadership, the default position is, where is the wealthy white man that can save us from the throes of hell? And so I think ultimately we've got to also unpack and really talk about how racism and structural racism creates this culture of fear. And oftentimes that culture of fear has us responding and have people responding in a way that literally they go to the default position. So part of this is really going to be a matter of, we've got to do grassroots organizing, we've got to educate people, and we really got to change the frame and the narrative to help people really think about what is success and what is leadership.
Yeah. So thank you, Latasha. That's great stuff. I want to get to a question from one of our viewers, and that is that, the giving pledge and the sort of adulation of billionaires in our society has sort of made it seem like it's fine to be a billionaire as long as you give all your money away or most of your money away. That there's nothing wrong with having a society where people accumulate tons of wealth so long as they give it back in certain forms. Farhad, I'm interested in your take on that question.
Well, so we work with a lot of social movement organizations, and we hear and deeply believe in the phrase and the concept that another world is possible. And when we talk about just transition, we talk a lot about how do we get away from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. But I think it behooves those of us who are in the philanthropic sector, whether we're individual donors, whether we're staff at foundations, no matter what our role is, to ask the question of, what does philanthropy look like in that other world? Because to me, it's a question of resource allocation. No matter how utopian the fantasy of the future is, we're still going to need to be able to allocate resources. And the question is that being done democratically? Now, to my eyes, having private philanthropy as it's currently defined, which I believe depends on the extraction and consolidation of wealth. I mean, I don't think somebody gets to have $6 billion unless other people were getting significantly less than that. And you can make the case that, you can do something in our economy, that you're not a gun runner or you're not this or you're not that. But I think the phrase that often gets used about you can't be neutral on a moving train, I think similarly right now, you can't be a neutral billionaire in an economy based on the history of extraction and exploitation that our economy has been based on. And so for me, reasons to think about bold giving is not just the urgency of the issues. We need to give big because of climate change. We need to give big because of gun violence. We need to give big because of all these things. Yes, that's a great reason. But another reason is that the structures we have for giving are inherently anti-democratic. And we can be transitional forms. We can explore ways to democratize decision-making, participatory budgeting, activist-led grant-making, all that kind of stuff. But when I think about the world that our grantees are building, private philanthropy, family philanthropy does not have that role because it does not exist at that scale in the first place. And so I very much, when I hear somebody like Michael Bloomberg say that, having $60 billion is fine as long as you're giving a significant chunk of it away, I raise big questions about, well, what were the circumstances that led you to have that much money in the first place when we have so many people in poverty, so many people who are homeless, so many people who are struggling with healthcare, all of these kinds of things that those resources could have been allocated towards without it having to depend on his generosity.
Important stuff. So I want to ask another question, maybe for both David and Latasha. Latasha, give me a thumbs up if you can hear now. I know you were having trouble. Okay, good. So Michael Bloomberg has spent $400 million so far on his campaign efforts. I'd love to hear what good things could he have done philanthropically instead with that money. I mean, Latasha, how far would $400 million go in terms of grassroots civic engagement? Or David, pick any other issue that you've covered. What could you do, or what could he have done with $400 million on those issues? Let's go to David first.
I would say I could so spend that $400 million for him. But I think one of the critical issues, if we're really talking about fundamentally America and strengthening America, there's an issue around voter suppression. Can you imagine the kind of dent that money could have had in literally eliminating voter suppression? Since 2014, there have been 33 million people, mostly people of color, who have been dropped from the voting rolls. And so we've got this fundamental issue where we are bleeding, losing people for voter suppression tactics. And there's not the resources that are actually feeding into that we need at the scale and at the rate in which it's happening. So one of the things that I think that there could have been a very robust pro-democracy effort that has started that literally is around addressing voter suppression. The second is, one of the things that is really interesting around I think the Bloomberg campaign is we recognize that he understands the power of communication. I was in Alabama, and every break, I saw at least 5 or 6 commercials, Bloomberg commercials, that he recognizes the power of messaging, and he recognizes the power of using communication and communicating. And so I also think that there's a way that if he recognizes, that the power of that communication and saying a particular message, that he also could have used that money, but it's his money and I can't tell him what to do with it, but I can certainly kind of envision of how it could have been used in a way that actually would fundamentally strengthen democracy and help educate people, and imagine if all of the commercials that we saw around Bloomberg with on the golf course or with Obama at a speech, that literally we saw in those commercials, we saw messages around from voter suppression to around educating people around issues to some fundamental thing that I'll raise the third part. And the third point that I'll say is there is a lack of part of this idea of that wealth means that you're smart and you know something, and being poor means something that you don't work hard, you're not smart. Part of it is, I think, fundamentally people in this country don't really know how the economy works, that they don't know fundamentally other than I go to work, I work, and this is a check that I get. And so I think that there's a lot that could have been done and should be done around that. If in fact there is an understanding of finance and financial systems and the economy, I think that there's a lot that could be put aside. That's not just around how do people just start individual businesses, but really how do we really deal with the wealth inequities in this country and the growing wealth inequities in this country? And how do we create and use resources to build innovation to deal with that? And so fundamentally, if people really understand, I think that there are ways that he could use his resources that could actually be a tool for empowerment of people, and not just about advancing his agenda, but literally. And I think in the ways, I don't think he should figure that out. I think he should give that money to groups that are doing this work. We know what to do with it. We know how to figure it out. And I think part of it is we've got the folks on the ground that's doing this work. And I think it's a matter of, are you going to use your money? And I think this is a larger question for philanthropy. Are you using your money in a way that is just transactional, right? Because you know what is best? Or are you really going to use this money in a way that is transformative, that at the end of the day, people know what they need and people know how to create those things of what they need? And I think on some level, I would like to see a more robust, not just for Bloomberg, but I think philanthropy in general has a need to really shift its paradigm of how it sees investment and what shapes how they prioritize what is to be invested in.
Great. Thanks, Latasha. David, how about your thoughts on what else could have been accomplished with $400 million?
I'm sure we could all. I'm sure we could all think of other things that could be accomplished with that $450 million rather than helping some billionaire buy his way into the Democratic nomination. Tom Steyer, by the way, has also spent a lot of money, and he has an even slimmer chance of getting anywhere. That said, with Bloomberg, it's not an either-or choice. There's plenty more money where that came from. I think the larger question here, though, is how much should we really be looking to billionaires or philanthropy generally to create a more just society? I think billionaires are very unlikely people to be strong allies in that effort. Some of them, like the Buffett kids, I think are very important players. But if you look at the last 100 years, a lot of the biggest gains for working people and marginalized communities were won long before philanthropy became the supersized sector that it is today. If you go back into the early 20th century, there wasn't, there's a couple foundations, big foundations like Rockefeller and Carnegie just starting out, but the progressive movement was fueled by people power. And I think in many ways, the rise of philanthropy, which bankrolls a whole professionalized class of do-gooders, many based in Washington, D.C., I'm not sure that's been a really good thing at all for the cause of progressive change. And so my guess is that when we see greater change in this country, it's not going to come. Look at Black Lives Matter, right? That didn't come from, that movement didn't come from philanthropy. Occupy Wall Street didn't come from philanthropy. The Tea Party on the right or the Christian right. These were movements that have worked with plutocrats, sure, but they were fundamentally grassroots movements. So I think we have to lower our expectations as to what philanthropy can do here.
Great. Thanks, David. So we are fast running out of time. I'm going to go to each of you in a second for your sort of closing thoughts, what you want to leave people with. I want viewers to know that the recording of this will be available and viewable online on the same channels that you've been watching on now. So if you enjoyed this discussion, send the link to your friends who you think you want to see this as well. I also want to give a shout out to NCRP's Director of Strategic Communications, Elbert Garcia, who is new with us and just put this together and is innovating in some really interesting ways for us. So final thoughts on the intersection of philanthropy, power, and politics. Farhad, let's go to you first.
An opportunity for someone in Mike Bloomberg's shoes to approach things differently without asking him to do anything that would be, I think per what David said, would just be unrealistic. For him to take the philanthropic stances that he takes, but take them with more of an ecosystem perspective. Okay, if he's going to move this many $1 million to larger, more top-down advocacy organizations, then how is he making sure that there are others moving complementary resources to the grassroots organizing sector? I'm not somebody who believes that the grassroots organizing sector can do everything by itself. I'm just somebody who believes that the grassroots organizing sector is tremendously under-resourced and is tremendously effective when resourced properly. So, I'm not saying that Bloomberg has to organize his entire philanthropy about supporting things differently, but to engage with partners in ways that are a little bit less holding the steering wheel and a little bit more moving in formation.
Great. Thanks, Farhad. Latasha, what are your final thoughts?
So, I think that while we can have this critique of Bloomberg, to have a critique of Bloomberg, we've got to be honest and have a critique of philanthropy. And that the nature of philanthropy has fundamentally been rooted in privilege and power. That having the privilege to decide what is important and what is not important, and have the power to even sometimes get people or to try to cajole people to do the kind of work that we think is important, to really focus on the policy that we think is important and not necessarily in the policy that they define themselves. And so I think it's important that we really examine and use this opportunity to really look at Bloomberg, to look at ourselves in this field and how this field is very reflective. to the behavior that we're seeing with Bloomberg and how it has fundamentally eroded and undermined democracy in this country. And I think the second thing is because we are in this moment, I think we can see this moment as, oh my God, America's going to hell in a handbasket. Or we can see this moment as an extreme opportunity for us to radical reimagine what America can be and what does it mean to democratize wealth. We should have that conversation. Since we have a Bloomberg, because we have billionaires running for office, this is an opportunity for us to have this conversation around wealth and capitalism and the intersection between wealth and social justice in this country, and really reframe this. I think we should lean into it and have these conversations and not allow these conversations to just get stuck and focused on one person or one candidate or few candidates, but have a larger issue around structural racism, the inequities of wealth, and the role and responsibility of philanthropy to transform itself as a field that is literally taking leadership from the ground instead of the reverse.
Great. Thanks, Latasha.
You're here.
David, bring us home.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we've learned from Bloomberg, his career over the past 20 years, is how much political giving and philanthropic giving often work hand in hand to build somebody's influence, and that underscores why a kind of traditional campaign finance agenda is not going to solve this problem of the wealthy converting their assets into power. Because you could get rid of all the money for that, all the gifts that go to campaigns and the lobbyists, but there's another major tributary in this mighty river of money going into politics, and that is philanthropy. And so I think that we need to be thinking more holistically about how that works.
Great. Thank you, David. And thank you to all of our panelists, Latasha, Farhad, and thanks to our viewers for joining us for this discussion. If you are with a nonprofit and you're not yet a member of NCRP, I encourage you to join and get involved with us, be part of this movement to make philanthropy better. And if you're a funder and you're not already with NCRP, please join us. And you can all follow us on Twitter or sign up for our email lists. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.